The sun sat low and weak in the winter sky, a pale disk behind a constant veil of gray clouds. For days, the only light I'd seen was that filtered through falling snow. The iron rails of the Northern Pacific were black lines against the white, a stark and desolate path that split my world in two. I was Calder Hayes, and I was a man who preferred to be alone. My small ranch was a wound I couldn't heal, a quiet testament to a barn fire 3 winters past that had taken my wife and newborn. Now I filled my days with work, a steady grind of cold hands and numb thoughts, a routine that kept the silence from breaking me. The blizzard had let up a bit, enough for me to get the team moving. I was heading to town for staples and supplies, the kind of trip that was nothing more than a list in my head. I didn't want to go near the rail camp if I could help it, but the depot was my only option. I drove with my mind on the wind, the way it lifted the fresh powder and sent it swirling across the plains, erasing the tracks I'd just made. A faint, ghostly whistle began to build from far down the line, a sound carried on the wind that promised nothing but more cold and the endless passage of time. My gaze, out of habit, followed the rails. That's when I saw her, a small, dark shape against the endless white. At first I thought it was a fallen branch or a discarded piece of rail tie, but then my eyes focused, sharpening on the still, unnatural stillness of it. A human figure bound to the wood. My breath hitched, a knot of ice in my chest. I didn't think. I couldn't. The whistle grew louder, a desperate scream of steel and steam. Time to weigh it would cost a life. I pulled the team to a stop, the harness leather creaking in the cold air. I jumped from the wagon bed before the wheels stopped, turning my boots sinking into the snow-crusted ground beside the tracks. She was a young woman lying on her side, hands and feet tied with thick rope that had already sawed through her winter clothes and into the skin. The cold had turned her lips cracked and blue, and her eyes were open wide and steady, watching the horizon. A Comanche woman. I could see the fine beadwork on her torn dress, the intricate patterns of her people. My heart hammered against my ribs, a loud, violent beat in the still air. She was a breath away from death, and the wind was taking even that. Her name, I would learn later, was Kiona Blackfeather. But in that moment, she was just a person, a life that was about to be snuffed out by the cruelest kind of men. The roar of the train was a low growl now, the hum of the rails vibrating up through the snow and into my bones. I knelt beside her, pulling my belt knife from its sheath. The worn horn grip was cold in my gloved hand. I knew a thing or two about knots. I'd spent a lifetime freeing livestock from tangled wire and rope. But this was different. I had to be careful, gentle. I slid the point of my blade under the first strand, binding her wrists, my hand trembling despite my best efforts to keep it still. I locked my knees to stop the tremor from running up my legs. My heart was a drum in my ears, drowning out the wind, drowning out the train. I focused on her skin, the raw red lines where the rope had bitten deep. I didn't look up at the engine that was now a monstrous shadow on the horizon. I didn't have time. The steel wheels were a deafening thunder, the steam a hot, violent cloud against the cold. I freed one wrist, then the other, pulling the rough rope away without letting it snap back and bite into her wounds. The knots at her ankles were tighter, frozen, almost solid by the cold and her struggling. I turned the blade, prying at a buried loop until a strand parted, then another. I grabbed her by the shoulders, feeling the lightness of her body as I dragged her off the ties and into the snow. The engine roared past, a cyclone of noise and hot air, and 1,000 tiny stones ticked against the spokes of my wagon. I heard a faint ringing in my ears, but I didn't look at the train as it disappeared into the cold distance. My eyes were on her. Her chest was rising and falling in shallow, panic breaths. She hadn't screamed. Not once. She looked at my hands, at the knife still in my grip, and a cold dread passed through me. This man might be another one of them. The thought I knew was a ghost between us. I slid my old wool coat under her back, protecting her from the splintered wood of the ties, and then I wrapped her in it, covering her from the frigid air. I lifted her, one arm under the knees where the skin was scraped, one under the shoulders where she worked to breathe. She was lighter than a child, a terrible thing to feel. I carried her to the wagon and set her on the bed, pulling a grain sack under her heels and the coat over her legs. I didn't look at her torn dress, didn't let my gaze linger on the exposed skin. Instead, I put the cut ropes across the shiny rail, a silent challenge. I wanted someone to see what had been done. I didn't spit or swear. I just acted. I climbed back to the seat, gathered the reins, and spoke the only words that fit. "Hold on." The wagon turned across the flats, the team moving at a brisk walk. I kept my face forward, my attention on the frozen ground. I knew she was watching me. The whistle of the train faded behind us, a memory of a sound that had almost killed her. I thought one step at a time. Get to the house. Water shade, wash the cuts, food salve, no questions unless invited. It was my rule, the only rule I had. Do the work in front of you and nothing sideways. We reached my house, a low cedar cabin with smoke curling from the iron stovepipe. The west wall showed new shakes where fire had once taken the old, a constant reminder of what I had lost. I pulled the wagon to line the bed with the front door. I climbed down and lifted her again, feeling the heat baked into her skin, the terrible lightness of her body telling me she hadn't eaten enough. I carried her through the doorway and laid her on the table, folding a blanket under her head. I steadied her shoulders with one hand when she tried to sit up, her body weak and trembling. Easy, I said, my voice low and calm. I went to the sink and pumped the handle until water ran clear, then filled a tin cup halfway. I brought it to her mouth. She took a small sip, paused, swallowed, then took another. She held the cup with both hands to keep it from shaking. I watched the way she closed her eyes as the water spread through a mouth gone dry for 2 days. She was tasting life again, and I could almost feel it too. I set a kettle on the stove and added kindling and a split length of pine, keeping the noise low. I brought out a tin basin and filled it with water, testing the heat with my knuckle. I set a clean rag beside it. I didn't touch her. I turned my back to give her space and the choice, and I stepped to the doorway looking out at the yard. I counted the small familiar things I always counted when sleep wouldn't come. A strip of bark loose on the cottonwood. 2 hens pecking in the dust. The leaning fence post I meant to mend. Behind me I heard the faint rustle of cloth. She was cleaning herself. I heard a small hiss as the water stung the raw skin. I stood still, letting her set the pace. She rinsed the dust from her face, her neck, the torn skin around her wrists and ankles. The water burned, but she kept going. She would not cry in front of a stranger. She gave a small knock on the table with her knuckles, and I turned. I brought the basin to the bucket by the door, emptied it and set it back down. I poured fresh water into it, cool this time. I brought out a tin of salve that smelled of pine and fat and set it near her hand. I looked at the burns and then at her eyes. Her mouth hardened for a moment, the memory of hands that had done harm close. She nodded once. She opened the tin herself and worked a thin line of ointment along the torn skin, her face still while it bit and then eased. She closed the tin and pushed it to the neutral ground between us. I warmed leftover beans and sliced bread. I poured coffee when the kettle sang. I placed the food where she could reach it without strain, and then I stepped to the porch, leaving the door open so she wouldn't feel trapped. I stood with my shoulder to the frame and watched the yard, listening to the quiet sounds from inside. The soft scrape of tin on wood, slow chewing, small sips. I told myself not to talk, to fill the quiet. Quiet was not a problem here. Kiona ate in small bites, her body wanting a rush but holding it back to avoid sickness. The coffee steadied her hands and the warmth spread into the empty places inside her. She studied my tools and my shelves, the things a person uses to tell truth. The stove was clean. The knife on the peg was kept sharp. The chipped cup sat to the right of a plate, in a way that looked practiced. The blanket by the stove showed a body had slept there. She put a line through one of her fears. This was not a camp of men. When she lowered the cup and rested both hands on the table, I came back in and sat across from her. I kept my elbows in, my voice low and even. "I'm Calder," I said. I didn't offer my hand. She watched my face for the tell that men give when they are about to turn the talk rough. She saw tired eyes, sun lines, and a jaw that set when I chose to keep my words short. "Kiona," she said, her voice a small whisper. "It costs less now. The water helped. The food helped. The quiet helped more." I nodded. I looked at the cuts on her wrists again and then at the salve tin. "There's more if you need it," I said. I didn't ask who did this. I didn't demand her story. I kept to what she could use. I stood and went to the small bedroom. I shook out a clean sheet and laid it on the bed. I set my old coat at the foot. I hung a clean shirt on the chair. I came back and spread a blanket near the stove for myself, banking the fire to hold through the night. Each move was plain meant to make the space workable. She watched me make the room ready. The simple order of it settled something in my chest. I looked at the rope burns, at the torn dress, and then at the door. I recognized the feeling rising in me. It was a cold, hard anger at men who do harm in groups and call it order. I closed my mouth on it. I had another task first. Keep this person from falling apart. Feed her. Let her sleep. Give back control inch by inch. I said, "What covers the ground without stepping past it? You can stay until you're whole." And then I added, No one comes in here unless I say so." Her eyes lifted to meet mine. She held them longer this time, measuring whether my words were weight or just air. She saw no performance in me. She nodded once. "All right," she said. I left the bedroom door open and the front door unlatched with the screen set so a cold winter breeze could move through. I spread my blanket by the stove and set my hat over my eyes. I knew sleep would be thin, but I would keep still and rest enough to handle the team and the ditch at first light. Kiona lifted her legs off the table and stood. She waited to see if the room tilted. It did not. She walked slow to the small bedroom. She touched the edge of the sheet to feel if it was clean. It was. She sat and eased back and felt the pull in her wrists. She breathed until the pain settled. She kept her moccasins on because taking them off would mean staying, and she wasn't ready to name that yet. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 2 days, she was not counting breaths for fear of running out. Morning came in thin light through the east window, the sky still a dull, heavy gray. The smell of coffee moved first. It woke me before the warmth of the stove did. I pushed myself up from the blanket and checked the room with a glance. Her door was still closed, but I heard the faint scrape of the chair legs in there. A slow step on the floorboards. She had moved on her own. That was something. I took the kettle off the hook, poured coffee into my chipped cup, and set another on the table for her. Outside, the team was already stamping in the wet snow, waiting for water. The air was frigid, the kind that didn't last past mid-morning. I made a note in my head: fence rails needed mending before the next blizzard hit. I was thinking about that when her bedroom door opened. She stepped out, still wearing the same torn dress from yesterday. But the calico scrap I'd left on the chair was now stitched into a rough collar that hid the rope marks at her throat. The work was quick but neat. I noticed the straight seam, the even tension on the thread. She was holding the silver and turquoise pendant in her fingers, rubbing the stone with her thumb like she was deciding whether to wear it or keep it hidden. She slipped it over her head and let it rest against her chest. Her eyes scanned the table, the stove, and then me. No words yet. I nodded toward the coffee. She stepped closer, took the cup, and drank in small pools. Her eyes closed once. She said nothing, but her shoulders dropped an inch, and I knew that was her way of telling me it was good. I set bread and beans on the table. She ate slow, checking the room between bites. I could tell she was measuring. How far to the door, how close I stood, what tools were within reach. It was the same way I measured after the fire, when anyone I knew felt like a risk. When the plates were cleared, I broke the silence. The ditch gates are frozen shut. The water won't run right to the corn. I didn't explain why I was telling her this. She decided to follow me without being asked. Outside, the sun had burned a faint mist from the snow-covered cottonwood leaves. The ditch was half dry, a thin trickle running toward the fields. The gate handle was swollen from last week's rain and had frozen solid. I set my shoulder to it, but it didn't give. I stepped back, and she put her hands on the handle. I braced the lower crossbeam while she pulled, and together we shifted it open enough for the water to push through. Cold mud swirled up from the bottom, coating our hands. She didn't let go until the flow was steady. We worked along the field edge, pulling small weeds from the ditch path so the water kept its line. Kiona glanced at the horizon more than once. I figured she was thinking about the trading post, about the cousin she was looking for. I broke the silence. "You going to want to try for the post?" She looked at me without stopping her hands. "Yes, but not yet." It was the first clear answer she'd given me. I nodded. "We'll go when you're ready." Back at the house, she washed her hands at the pump. The rope burns on her wrists were red again from the mud. I went inside and brought out the salve tin, placing it on the porch rail near her. She took it, worked the ointment in with her thumb, and set it back without a word. I had questions, but I kept them. I knew the rail camp was less than 3 miles down the line, and the section boss there wouldn't forget she was here. What I didn't know, and what the men in the camp didn't either, was that I'd already decided she was under my roof until she chose to leave. Kiona finished at the pump and looked out at the corral. The missing rails in the far corner caught her eye. "Something get through?" she asked. The first question she'd asked me. Last month, a stray cow from Merritt's place took down the post. She studied it a second longer, then walked toward the barn without waiting. Inside, she ran her hand along the row of tools until she found a post hole digger. She carried it out and set it near the gap. I watched her from the porch. She wasn't asking to help. She was telling me she would. Before the sun dropped too low, we'd set 2 new rails and tightened the corner. She was quick with her hands, and I worked in rhythm with her without talking about it. By the time we put the tools away, the light was starting to fade, the air getting colder. That night, she took the chair near the stove, while I made coffee again. Neither of us spoke much. The quiet was easier now. When I set the tin of salve on the table again, she didn't wait for me to step away. She opened it, applied it, and pushed it back toward me. I noticed her checking the latch on the door before she went to the bedroom. It wasn't distrust. It was habit. I'd done the same every night for 3 years. When the house was dark, I lay awake listening for anything on the road. Nothing came but the cold wind through the cottonwood. In the other room, Kiona was awake too, thinking about how quickly the train had closed the distance on the rails. About how I hadn't asked her who tied her there. She decided she would stay a little longer. Not for safety alone, but because the quiet here wasn't the kind that crushes a person. It was the kind that lets you breathe. I was up before the first light touched the cottonwood splitting wood by the shed. I liked the sound of the axe clean final. It kept the mind still. The barn door was open, a hand's width the way I'd left it the night before to let air move through. I noticed a faint scuff of fresh boot marks in the snow near the threshold. Kiona's moccasins. She'd been out here before me. I found her inside, standing beside the wagon bed. She had a coil of rope in her hands, running it through her fingers to check for frays. Without looking up, she said, "You left this on the rail." Her tone wasn't sharp, but she was making sure I knew she'd seen the cut strands I left as proof of what happened. I set the axe aside. "Men in town need to see it," I said. She didn't answer, just looped the rope neatly and set it on the shelf. The smell of fresh coffee pulled us both back toward the house. On the porch, I noticed she had hung her mended dress on the line collar, straight neckline, repaired enough to keep eyes from wandering. She was wearing one of my old work shirts, now sleeves rolled, a belt tied at the waist to fit her. The rope burns on her wrists were fading to a dull red. Over breakfast, I finally asked the question that had been in my head since the rescue. "Why did they tie you to the tracks?" Her hand paused halfway to her mouth. She set the fork down carefully. "I took something, I didn't." She kept her eyes on the plate. "They wanted me to admit it so they could send me off the land. I didn't give them the words." I studied her face, looking for any flicker that would tell me more, but she wasn't offering it. I let it be. After the plates were cleared, we worked the corral together, checking rails we hadn't reached the day before. I showed her how to test a post for rot by pressing the heel of my boot into the base and listening for the dull crack that meant trouble. She learned quick. By mid-morning, we had a small pile of broken rails to burn. When the sun reached overhead, I suggested heading into town for grain and nails. Kiona hesitated. I saw at her eyes narrowing, her weight shifting toward the barn. "I'll stay," she said. "Too many faces there." I didn't push. "Suit yourself," I replied. But before leaving, I set the rifle on the table inside the house and checked the chamber. "Keep the door latched. Don't open it for anyone unless you know them." She gave a small nod. The trip to town was uneventful. I kept my head down at the mercantile. The section boss wasn't around, and I was glad for it. On the way back, I stopped at Ada Merrick's place, picking up vinegar and a small bundle of clean cloth she'd prepared without asking. Ada's only words were, "Make sure she uses it and keep her out of sight of certain folks." I gave a short nod and moved on. When I reached the farm, I noticed the door was still latched from inside. Kiona opened it only after I called her name. Inside, the rifle was back on its rack, and the smell of something cooking filled the air, beans and onions. She'd used what we had without asking, which told me she was beginning to act like she belonged here. That evening, we sat on the porch with the vinegar cloth pressed to her wrists. She didn't flinch when the sting hit. "Ada sent this?" she asked. "Yes," I said. A short pause. "She's a good one, keeps her own counsel." Before dark, I brought the horses in from the field, and Kiona followed with a bucket of water. The horses took to her quickly, lowering their heads for her hand. She ran her palm down a gelding's neck with slow, steady pressure. I watched. I could see she'd handled animals before, maybe back at the trading camp. She caught me looking. "You wondering how I know?" she asked. I nodded once. "My uncle kept horses. Said they tell you more than people do." Night settled in quiet. The lantern burned low on the table while I checked the latch on the front door. In the bedroom, Kiona folded her mended dress and sat on the chair, the pendant still looped neatly over the collar. She glanced toward the small window, listening for any sound from the road. Nothing came but the cottonwood leaves moving in the dark. In the quiet between us, I was already making a decision I hadn't spoken aloud. If the men from the rail camp came looking, I'd stand in the doorway and make it clear she wasn't theirs to bother again. And Kiona, lying down with the work shirt pulled over her knees, made a choice of her own. She'd stay, but only until she was strong enough to face the post and the search for her cousin. without anyone deciding her fate for her. The next morning broke clear and windless, the kind of day I usually used for hauling into town before the cold made the team sluggish. I planned to take Kiona with me sooner or later, but I knew the first time would draw eyes. Still, it had to be done. Supplies were running low, and if anyone in town was talking about what happened on the tracks, I wanted to hear it myself. She stepped out of the bedroom while I was finishing my coffee. The rope burns on her wrists were fading into thin, dark lines. She'd taken her mended dress off the chair and paired it with one of my spare belts to pull it in at the waist. The collar she'd sewn herself sat neat against her throat. I thought she looked ready to be seen, but not ready to be stared at. "You coming into town today?" I said, more statement than question. She hesitated, one hand resting lightly on the table. "If I go, I'm not answering questions," she said. "Don't need you to," I replied. "Just walk beside me and keep your eyes on what matters." We set out mid-morning with a wagon bed half-empty, leaving room for flour nails and a sack of barley I'd promised Ada Merrick. The road into town was quiet until we reached the rise before Main Street. From there, the buildings sat in a line: mercantile, blacksmith, saloon, sheriff's office, each one already busy with the day's work. Inside the mercantile, I loaded the counter with my list, while Kiona moved through the aisles looking over bolts of cloth, sacks of beans, and a small tin of sewing needles. She kept her back to the room, letting me handle the talk with Mr. Keene, the shop owner. A few customers glanced our way but didn't linger. She noted each one whose face looked curious and whose looked calculating. It wasn't until we stepped back outside that trouble showed. Two men from the rail camp were standing by the hitching post. One of them the same foreman who had been laughing the day I found her. His voice carried over the sound of the street. "Well, looks like the wildcat's been tamed." His eyes stayed on Kiona. She froze for half a breath, then looked past him as if he were part of the wall. I kept walking, adjusting my grip on the flour sack in my arm. "That woman's under my roof," I said without raising my voice. "Don't talk about my roof." The foreman smirked but didn't step closer. The second man muttered something I didn't catch, and they both moved toward the saloon. We made the rest of our stops without incident. At Ada Merrick's, I traded the barley and took the sack of potatoes she'd set aside for me. Ada's eyes shifted once to Kiona but didn't linger. Weathers, holding Ada, said, simply handing over the sack. I knew she'd heard something in town and had chosen not to repeat it. That was Ada's way. On the ride back, Kiona sat angled toward the fields, her eyes tracking the fence lines. "That man at the post," she said finally. "He was there." I kept my hands steady on the reins. "I know," I said. "He won't set foot on my land." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away from the horizon either. Back at the farm, she went to the pump and washed her hands, then brought in a basin of water without being asked. I unpacked the supplies, setting the flour and beans in the corner nails on the shelf, and the sewing needles on the table where she could see them. That evening we worked side by side in the small garden behind the house, pulling the last of the weeds from the frozen bean rows. Kiona moved with quiet efficiency. Every handful of roots was tossed into the bucket with purpose. I watched the way she checked the ground as she worked, scanning for snake holes the same way she must have back at the trading camp. It told me more about her than any story she might have told. After dark, we sat on the porch. The night was still, the cottonwood whispering above. I told her we'd ride for the trading post in a week if she was ready. She nodded once. "I'll be ready," she said. In her mind, she was already making the plan: what to ask, who to avoid, and how to make sure she left no trail for the men who had tied her to those tracks. Inside, when I latched the door for the night, I caught her watching the rifle on the rack. I wondered if she was picturing what she would do if those men ever came up the lane, and from the look in her eyes, I knew she already had the answer. The week passed with steady work, and without anyone riding up the lane. But I kept a quiet watch each day, checking the road before first light, and again before the sun dropped behind the ridge. I didn't tell Kiona about the two riders I'd seen at a distance on the third day. Too far off to make out faces, but they lingered on the high road before moving on. I figured she had enough in her head without that added weight. By the morning we were set to leave for the trading post, the air was dry and still. I had the wagon hitched early, a canteen full, and a small sack with bread and beans for the road. I'd sharpened the knife on my belt the night before, more out of habit than need. Kiona stepped out wearing her mended dress again, the belt cinched, her pendant resting at her chest. She carried nothing in her hands, but I saw the thin coil of rawhide tucked into the belt, a makeshift tie light enough to be a rope, heavy enough to be a weapon if needed. We rode without much talk. The road to the post followed the rail line for part of the way, then cut off through low grass and scattered mesquite. Kiona scanned every face we passed: 2 wagon drivers, a pair of women with baskets, a ranch hand leading a lame mule. None she knew. The trading post sat low and wide, its walls weathered and its porch shaded. The air inside was heavy with the smell of hides, coffee, and old tobacco. I waited near the counter while she moved along the back wall, speaking quietly with the older Navajo man who handled goods for her people. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the shake of the man's head. She asked again, and he pointed toward the far shelf where a younger man was stacking tins. She spoke with him too, but his answer was the same. Her cousin hadn't been seen here in months. She returned to me with her face unreadable. Nothing, she said. Not here. I gave a short nod. We'll check again another time. I didn't press her for details. On the way out, I caught sight of Sheriff Sutter leaning in a doorway across the street. The man's eyes flicked from me to Kiona, then back again. He pushed off the post and stepped forward. "Hayes," he said, "heard you've been keeping company out your way." I met his gaze without shifting the sack in my arm. "She's under my roof. That's all you need to know." Sutter smirked. "Long as there's no trouble, I don't care." The way he said it told me he did care, just not in any way that meant help. We left without looking back. On the road home, Kiona broke the silence. "That sheriff, he knows the men from the camp." I kept my eyes on the ruts ahead. "He knows everyone chooses what he wants to hear." That answer seemed to fit what she already thought. By the time we reached the farm, clouds were building over the ridge. I set the team in the corral and checked the sky. "Storm before night," I said. Kiona followed me to the stacked hay near the barn. We pulled canvas over the top, tying it down against the wind that was already pushing in. The first dust hit us as we worked sharp against the skin. Her hair whipped across her face and she caught it back with the rawhide from her belt. I held out a leather thong from my pocket. She took it without hesitation, tied her hair, and returned it, her fingers brushing my palm. We made it inside just as the first drops turned to hard rain on the roof. I banked the stove while she lit the lamp. The sound of the storm filled the room. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she stepped closer, her voice low. "If they come here again, the men from the camp, what will you do?" I didn't answer right away. I met her eyes, steady and certain. "Stand in the doorway. Make sure they leave." She studied me for a moment, then gave a single nod as if that was all she needed to hear. Outside, the rain came harder, washing the dust from the air. Inside, the two of us sat at the table, the sound of the storm between us, and the sense that for now, the road ahead, however uncertain, was ours to choose. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the ground damp and the air cooler than it had been in weeks. I stepped outside to check the corral. The rails we'd repaired still held firm, but one of the corner posts leaned slightly from the wind. I made a note to reset it later. The team was restless, stamping in the wet soil, and I gave them extra grain to settle them. Inside, Kiona was already at the table, her hair braided, the mended dress replaced with my work shirt again, sleeves rolled. She had the sewing needles I'd bought in town laid out next to a length of cloth. "Figured I'd make a second dress," she said without looking up. I poured coffee, nodding. "You'll have enough for 2 by the time the beans come in. We'll trade some." It wasn't quite permission, she didn't need that, but it was a sign I saw her as part of the running of the place. While she worked the needle, I took the shovel to clear the ditch of debris washed in by the storm. Halfway through the morning, Ada Merrick's figure came into view down the lane, walking briskly with a covered basket on her arm. I met her at the gate. She handed me the basket without fuss. "Bread, dried apples, and vinegar," she said. "Heard in town that the foreman's been asking questions." My jaw tightened. "He won't get answers here." Ada gave me a steady look. "Good. Keep it that way. You both need time." She didn't linger, just turned back down the road. I brought the basket in. Kiona paused her stitching. "She knows?" she asked. "She knows enough," I said. "And she's not the talking kind." Kiona gave a short nod, then set the sewing aside to slice the bread. We ate in the quiet, the sound of a knife on the board filling the space where questions might have been. Later, I decided it was time she knew the land better. I led her past the corn, across the narrow strip of ground, and out to the east fence line. I showed her where the property ended, how the land dipped toward the creek bed. "If trouble ever comes and I'm not here, you follow the creek north until you hit the old bridge. Ada's place is half a mile past it," I told her. She listened closely, glancing at each landmark as if fixing it in her mind. "And if they see me before I get there," she asked. "Then you make them see you mean to keep walking," I said. We spent the afternoon mending the lean in the corral post. I dug out the soft soil, set the base deeper, and packed it tight with rock. Kiona held the post upright without complaint. her hands steady even when the wood pressed hard against her shoulder. The work was slow, but by the time the light shifted toward evening, the post stood firm again. Over supper, she finally asked something that had been hanging since the day on the tracks. "Why did you stop for me?" Her tone wasn't accusing, more like she was taking a measure of the truth. I kept my eyes on the bread in my hands. Didn't think about it. Saw someone tied where no one ought to be. Knife was in my belt. That was enough. She studied me for a moment longer, then returned to her plate. Before night, I checked the rifle, setting it within easy reach by the door. I didn't say why, and she didn't ask, but both of us knew the foreman's questions in town were reason enough. Kiona brought in the last of the clean wash from the line, folded it, and set it on the chair by her bed. The pendant hung over the collar of her mended dress, just as it had from the first day she'd sewn it. When we settled in, the house felt different, more like it was holding two people who knew where they stood even if they hadn't said it out loud. Outside, the night was still, but both of us, without saying so, kept one ear tuned for the sound of boots on the lane. 2 days passed without a sign of anyone on the lane, and the quiet began to feel less like waiting for trouble and more like a rhythm we could live in. I didn't let that make me careless. I kept the rifle close at night and checked the fence line each morning. Kiona kept to her work, finishing the second dress, feeding the hens, sweeping the porch without being asked. It was the kind of cooperation that didn't need to be spoken about, but it showed in the way the place looked less like a man's farm and more like a home. On the third day, just before noon, I was in the barn mending a halter strap when I heard hoofbeats too steady to be a neighbor passing by. I stepped into the doorway, wiping my hands on my trousers. 2 riders came into view at the far end of the lane. One I recognized immediately, the rail camp foreman. The other was a younger man, maybe 20, but carrying himself with the same careless posture. I felt the familiar tension in my shoulders. I walked to the porch and waited. Kiona stepped out of the house when she heard the hooves, her eyes narrowing. She didn't go back inside, just stood by the wall with her hands loose at her sides. I glanced at her once and gave a small shake of my head, a signal to stay silent. The riders stopped short of the porch. "Heard you've got something that belongs to us," the foreman said, his voice carrying a smug edge. I stayed where I was, feet planted. "Not yours," I said evenly. "Not now, not ever." The younger man leaned forward on his saddle horn. "We just want to talk to her," he said. Kiona's jaw tightened, but she didn't move. My eyes didn't leave the foreman. "You've said enough already," I replied. "Turn your horses around and take the road back to camp." The foreman smiled, like he was weighing whether to push. I didn't raise my voice, but the way my hand rested on the porch rail made it clear the conversation was over. After a long moment, the foreman clicked his tongue and both men turned their horses without another word. I watched them until they were well past the cottonwood. Inside, Kiona closed the door herself and slid the latch. "They'll be back," she said quietly. I nodded. "Maybe, but they won't find you alone." That afternoon, I decided it was time for her to learn the rifle. I set up a flat piece of tin at the far fence and showed her how to hold the stock tight against her shoulder, how to work the lever, and how to keep her breathing steady before the trigger pull. She listened without interrupting. The first shot went wide, but the second clipped the edge of the tin. She gave no smile, no show of pride, but her eyes lingered on the mark before she handed the rifle back. Before dark, we walked the fence together. I pointed out the places where a determined man might slip through without being seen from the house. I told her how to use the creek bed as cover if she ever had to leave fast. She didn't ask questions, just took in every detail. That night over supper, she broke the silence. "If I find my cousin, and if she wants to come here, would you let her?" I looked up from my plate. "If you say she's under your roof, then she's under mine," I said simply. She gave a short nod, the answer settling something in her. Later, as the lamplight dimmed, I banked the stove and checked the latch. Kiona lingered at the table, her pendant resting in her palm. "I don't know if she's alive," she said quietly, almost to herself. I didn't offer comfort I couldn't guarantee. "We'll keep looking," I said. "And until then, you've got a place here." The house was quiet again when we went to our separate rooms. But the sound of those hoofbeats on the lane stayed in both our minds, a reminder that the rail camp's reach wasn't far enough to touch her here. Not while I was standing in the doorway. 2 mornings after the foreman's visit, the air turned sharp with a wind out of the north. I was up early loading the wagon with a few sacks of corn to take into town. I wasn't looking forward to it. I didn't want to leave the place unattended, but flour lamp oil and salt were running low. Kiona came out while I was tightening the ropes. She wore the second dress she'd sewn, plain but well fitted, and her hair was pulled back tight. "I'm coming with you," she said. I studied her face for a moment. "Sure," I asked. She gave a short nod. If they're going to see me, I'd rather be on my terms. I accepted that without further talk, handed her the smaller canteen, and we set off. The streets were busy when we rolled in. I went to the mercantile first, keeping an eye on the door while she moved to the shelves. She chose a length of strong cord, a packet of dried beans, and a tin of buttons. When we reached the counter, Sheriff Sutter was already there, leaning against the far end. His eyes went from me to Kiona, then back to me. "Hayes," the sheriff said casually. "Foreman came into my office yesterday. Claims you've got property that isn't yours." My jaw tightened. "She's not property and you know it." Sutter shrugged. "I'm not here to argue law. Just passing along what I heard. Might be easier on you if you didn't make enemies you don't need." I didn't bother to answer that. I paid for the goods and we left. On the way back, we stopped at Ada Merrick's. Ada stepped out onto the porch before we'd even pulled up. "You've stirred the pot," she said, her tone not angry, just matter of fact. I unloaded the sack of cornmeal I'd promised her. "It was already stirred," I replied. Ada's eyes softened as they landed on Kiona. "You've got more color in your cheeks," she said to her. "That's good. Don't let the likes of them take it from you." Kiona only nodded but held Ada's gaze long enough to make it clear she understood the weight of the words. Back at the farm, the wind had picked up, rattling the barn doors. I set Kiona to checking the latch on the hen house while I stored the supplies. Later, we both worked at the corral, tightening the wire where the last storm had loosened it. She worked without needing instruction, now moving with the easy rhythm of someone who knows their place in the job. When the sun dropped low, I decided it was time to make a stand about the foreman's claim. "Tomorrow," I said as we sat on the porch, "we go back to the rails. The spot where I found you. We're going to mark it so no one can pretend it didn't happen." Kiona's brow tightened, but there was no hesitation. "I'll tie the last knot myself," she said. The next day, we loaded 2 cedar posts wire and a strip cut from the dress she'd been wearing on the tracks. The ride was quiet, each of us set on the work ahead. At the place where the ties stretched straight into the horizon, I drove the posts into the ground beside the rail. I strung the wire and tied the cloth so it hung in the cold wind. "This happened," I said, my voice steady but carrying. Kiona stepped forward and tied the final knot, pulling it tight. As she did, a flatbed car clattered by carrying men from the camp. Some looked away, but none of them spoke. We stayed there until the train sound was gone. Then we turned back for home, leaving the cedar post standing. It wasn't just a marker, it was a warning. And both of us knew it meant the next move, if there was one, would be on the foreman's side. That night, with the door latched and the lamp low, Kiona sat at the table, her pendant resting in her palm. "If they come again," she said quietly, "I want them to see I'm still here." I met her eyes and nodded once. "They will." The foreman never came the next day, nor the day after, but I didn't mistake the silence for peace. I lived long enough to know some men would rather wait for an opening than charge in and fail twice. Still, the marker at the tracks had done what it was meant to. Word had spread in town. A few people nodded to me when I passed, and some kept their distance, but no one pretended they didn't know what had been done to Kiona. A week later, with the corn almost ready to cut, I asked her straight, "Do you want to try for the trading post again?" She stood by the porch rail looking toward the road. "Yes," she said, "but I want to come back here after. This place is steady." I didn't push for more, just nodded. "We'll go in the morning." The trip was quicker this time. At the post, Kiona spoke with the same elder and a different young man. This time there was a lead. Someone had seen a girl who might be her cousin traveling with a family headed east 2 months back. It wasn't much, but it was enough for her to know the search wasn't over. On the way home, I stopped the team by the creek and let them drink. "If you want to go after her, I'll drive you," I said. Kiona looked at me for a long moment, weighing the truth of it. "I will look again," she said, "but I want this place to be here when I come back." We returned to the farm just before sundown. The air smelled of cut hay from Merrick's fields down the road. I went straight to the barn to check the latch. Kiona went to the garden, picking the first beans from the late row we planted together. She brought them inside in her cupped hands and set them on the table with a small smile. That night, I took apart the narrow bed frame in my own room. I worked in slow, careful steps, joining the boards with pieces from the spare cot until the frame was wide and solid. When it was done, I set 2 clean blankets side by side. I didn't call her in, just left it as it was and went about banking the stove. Later, after the lamp was turned low, she appeared in the doorway holding her own blanket. Without a word, she laid it over the bed I'd built. We both lay down, not touching at first, but the distance closed before sleep came. I woke only when the first light touched the window, realizing I'd slept the whole night through a thing I hadn't done in years. The days that followed fell into an easy shape. We worked the ditch together, cut the corn, and stacked it for drying. Ada came by with bread and news from town. The foreman had left the rail camp for work farther west. I didn't ask why. I just felt the weight in my shoulders ease a notch. By the first frost, the corn was stored. The fence was solid, and the marker on the track still stood. Kiona hung her pendant on a small nail above the table where she could see it each morning. "This is your home," I said one evening as we set the cups side by side. She looked at me steady and sure. "Ours," she corrected. I didn't argue. Outside, the wind carried the smell of cedar smoke from the stove, and the cottonwood leaves rattled softly. Inside, the house held us in quiet, not as strangers tied together by danger, but as two people who had chosen to stay. And in that choice, everything else was settled. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.